Welcome to the EO Podcast with Bret Keisling, part of the EO Podcast Network.
Hello, my friends. Thanks for listening. My name is Bret Keisling, and as it says on my business cards, I'm a passionate advocate for employee ownership. Just 1 week ago, on April 9th and 10th, 2024, in Washington, D.C., the amazing, incredible, and important Employee Ownership Ideas Forum was presented, a 2-day program co-sponsored by the Aspen Institute and the Rutgers Institute for the Study of Employee Ownership and Profit Sharing. And I am so delighted to have two guests returning to the podcast. We have had them on before. We have talked about them both awful lot of times. But Maureen Conway of the Aspen Institute and Adria Scharf of the Rutgers Institute are both on the podcast. Maureen, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Bret. Great to be here. And I should say I lead the Economic Opportunities Program at the Aspen Institute. And it is the Economic Opportunities Program that's really working hard with the Institute for Employee Ownership and Profit Sharing at Rutgers to bring everyone the Employee Ownership Ideas Forum.
Well, welcome back, Adria. Thank you so much for joining me.
So happy to be here, Bret. Thank you.
So we want to take a little bit of time, and I appreciate both of you for making time for us today on the podcast, but I really appreciate all of the work and efforts that went into this incredible program. So we just want to take a little bit to kind of reflect, talk about what took place at the program, where it met your expectations, where it exceeded them, and maybe what you tried doing differently next year. And we'll start with you, Maureen, but boy, as someone who participated virtually on both days, you ran an incredible program. It was great.
Great. Thank you so much, Bret. I appreciate you saying that. And actually, I kind of feel the same way. I really felt like our panels were all really good. Our speakers all spoke to the points that we hoped that they would touch on. And I think the thing that I sort of came away, or at least the thing I'm reflecting on now, is the different ways that each of the speakers and the panels kind of really hit on not just the sort of the value of employee ownership in terms of the wages and benefits for workers and business resilience and good for communities, but also the values that animate employee ownership, the ways in which workers not only are sort of, get better pay and better paycheck, but they have more control and more agency. And it was interesting to me that both Congressman Larry Bucshon and Senator Bernie Sanders both spoke to the value it has for workers to have some control and some input into their workplace and that feeling of respect, right? It's not just about your paycheck. It's also about respect and contribution. It's about opportunities to learn, but it's also about the opportunity to be part of something bigger than yourself, right? And I really loved how Molly Hemstreet talked about, sort of the way people learn kind of how to negotiate with each other and how to stay together, even when they don't get what they want, right? So even when you don't get everything you want, you still kind of go forward together. And the ways she sees in her community, people bringing that out into how they participate in their community. They learn to participate at work, and then they learn to participate in decision-making on the school board or in other things. So these values that kind of animate employee ownership in terms of how we are human beings in our economic arrangements together and how we bring our full humanity to the work. I just loved that. And I felt like so many speakers hit on that in so many different ways. So I feel like that's my top of mind reflection that I'm sitting with right now.
I absolutely love that, and it raised several comments that I'll make, but first we'll bring Adria in, and Adria, just looking back, and for those who are listening, we're actually recording this on Friday. They were so kind to come in just a day and a half after the conference ended, but looking back on it, I'm sure you feel good, but what are you thinking and what are you liking?
Yeah, thank you so much, Bret. Just echoing Maureen to start, I agree with the way she articulated that kind of thread of values. And I felt like the very first speaker, Dan Porterfield, the president and CEO of Aspen Institute, sort of set that tone from the very start in his opening framing remarks, which included some language about employee ownership reflecting the values of a more moral economy in democratic capitalism. I think it was such a rich 2 days. I really appreciated, first of all, how deep several of the panelists went. Every single person on that stage had such a wealth of expertise and experience. We had one panel that was focused on innovations at the state level. And in fact, this year's Employee Ownership Ideas Forum had the theme of employee ownership on the ground. So our intention Aspen Institute Economic Opportunities Program and the Rutgers Institute, we very much wanted to be grounding the conversation in the kind of localized community and state level experimentation that's happening across the country. But I really enjoyed, and I've been in this work for some time, but I had some aha moments, Bret. I had some aha moments the last
I love that you said that.
in particular, the state policy session on day one, which sort of opened the lid on what some of the most forward-thinking progressive states are really doing, but kind of like really getting into the mechanics of the politics at the state level, both in Colorado, which is really kind of leading among states in terms of pushing through substantial tax credits and other incentives for employee ownership conversions. And then also in Washington state, we had a Republican state senator, Michael Patton, who spoke about how, he'd been serving in the Washington state legislature, he might have said for 19 years, and usually it's just arduous to get anything through, but he just described how this topic, we talk about it having bipartisan support, but he talked about how it was sort of in the blink of an eye, he had all of his allies on the Republican side, but then tremendous amount of support on the Democratic side, and the proposal to start an employee ownership initiative in Washington state sort of sailed through. It's really interesting to hear those folks talk about those sort of nuts and bolts steps that were required. And each of our panel, and this is credit to the Aspen team, we at the Rutgers Institute for this study of employee ownership and profit sharing, we were part of the process and together with Aspen, but I really credit Maureen's team at Aspen for the care they took in planning the details around this event. But we carefully crafted each session. And as a result, I did feel like we kind of cut into this question of employee ownership in some really new and different ways that I have not seen articulated before, whether through the focus on rural communities or innovation at the state level, or I led one session focused on supply chain resiliency, which is sort of, don't often think about employee ownership in the context of supply chain resiliency, which is a really important topic, and the panelists had very much to say.
I think that was great. And just talking about the political folks, and you'd mentioned the gentleman from Washington State who was on the panel. You also had a couple of senators and a congressperson or two come in and speak. And what impressed me, and I mean to my core, Senator Van Hollen, when he was speaking, he knew employee ownership. We have all heard politicians at various levels speak at various things, and you can tell when they're kind of speaking the words that the staff has put in front of them. And that's fine too. I'm not belittling that. But the folks who were speaking walk the walk and talk the talk with employee ownership. And I thought that was so important and so cool.
Yeah, no, that was great. And, as I mentioned when I introduced Senator Van Hollen, he shows up for this all the time, right? So we did a series of public events around employee ownership at the Aspen Institute, and we asked him if he would come and help us kick it off, and he did. He came last year and gave remarks, and he and his team also was helping us get the room at the Capitol. This year it was Senator Shaheen's team, who were terrific to work with and helped us get the room and everything. So, but yeah, he really shows up, and he shows up all the time. And that's, I think that was also a real great thing to see, because we also had representatives of a number of federal agencies show up this year. And I think that was also really, really impactful for the audience. They really appreciated having Lisa Gomez from the Department of Labor come and sort of be I thought, very forthright with, the audience about sort of where things were in the rulemaking process there and what she was trying to do to move things forward. And I thought that was really appreciated by people. Really were glad to see that they're really trying to really drive the Work Act forward within the Department of Labor. And so I think that was very much appreciated. Similarly, I felt like, David Brown from the SBA was really helpful in sort of talking through what have been some of the stumbling blocks for people to get SBA financing or other sort of things to support employee ownership, and what they're thinking about there in terms of addressing those stumbling blocks and making things work better going forward. It was nice to have Alex Jackas from the White House there to, sort of really give the full-throated support. And Leroy Garcia, of course, the Department of Agriculture, right, has such long-standing support for rural business cooperatives. And so it was great to have them. They came last year. It was great to have them back. And, so I think this feeling that people are really showing up from all dimensions, I think was really also a key piece. So it was great that we had all of these amazing businesses from across the country that came, but it was also really great that the federal policymakers and the state legislators and all the federal agencies, that they were there too, sort of thinking about where do we fit in, where do we contribute? Because the thing is, and you may have seen this piece that I wrote with Joseph Blasi and Matt Helmer that came out in Fast Company about sort of, employee ownership is so great. And we all know how great it is, right? It's good for workers, good for business, good for communities, good for the economy. Like, why don't we have more of it? And, as we were sort of thinking about it, we were just kind of like, it's this little system here and this system here. Like it's not one thing, it's a million details in different places, right? That sort of make the systems not work, make the financing system not work, make the advising system not work, make all the systems not really work particularly well for broad-based employee ownership. And so it's nice to have people who kind of represent different pieces of those systems kind of in the conversation to sort of say, okay, what do I do with my piece of the system to try to start making those things all work better? So I thought that was really fantastic.
As you were speaking, Maureen, and it made perfect sense, it struck me that as much, and I'll refer to the employee ownership community as us, we, the employee ownership community, as important as it was for us to have them in our presence and our being able to hear them speak and hear their thoughts, I imagine there was great value in them seeing us and hearing from us and understanding, the reality is in employee ownership 10 years ago, there was, and more recently, but, just an inherent bias against employee ownership. And even ESOPs were considered, problematic by the government, et cetera. And so tremendous value in having them come and meet all of our thought leaders and practical business leaders.
Yeah, I think that's really true. So among my tasks that I've been doing following up, of course, is, reaching back out to folks to share a note of thanks and really appreciate all of our speakers and folks who've come. And I think that's kind of what I was hearing from some folks is that they really enjoyed being there to see how, to hear from this community and to really have the opportunity to engage. And as you noted, particularly the elected officials, they really believe in this, right? And so for them to sort of see the people that are trying to drive it forward, I do think that they really like that opportunity. And I think it is helpful for everybody to have a presence and to be present, and on the Capitol and in other spaces to sort of, we keep thinking like that employee ownership, it's the best kept little secret, but we're not trying to keep it a secret, right? So how do we really start giving it more visibility? And I think when we do, it's as Adria was saying before, it's just a natural for all of them to come in and say, this makes so much sense. How do we have more of it?
I love that. So Adria, can you give a little bit of insight? Because I think you had mentioned in your comments, there were a lot of important subtexts going on throughout the conference, a lot of the details, the focus we had mentioned on rural America. And I think I had said Daniel Goldstein will be on next week's podcast, which we've already recorded. To understand employee ownership in rural America is to get a better sense of the problems with the infrastructure and the problems if you don't have Wi-Fi, you can't work remotely. And it seemed, and Maureen, I think you had made this point as well, but it seems that there are so many things that take employee ownership well beyond the capital structure of the company into transforming lives and transforming communities.
Absolutely. I don't know, Maureen, if you agree. I feel like we very intentionally framed the topics to place employee ownership in the context of highly relevant and important current social, political, economic framings. So, the session on supply chain resiliency happening sort of a few years after, the pandemic revealed the incredible fragility of our supply chains and the consequences of that. And, the current presidential administration passing through infrastructure and a new focus on supply chain resiliency, really elevating that and sort of like positioning employee ownership in the context of sort of that frame to kind of flush out its relationship to supply chain resilience, to bolstering critical industries, to and all, like you said, all the different sort of sub themes within that. In the context of that conversation, some of the speakers surfaced, the ways that because their employees were owners, they were willing to work through the pandemic. They were willing to turn on a dime and build a new factory in order to reshore some critical component of their product, back in the United States that had been overseas. And just the way that the kind of employee ownership sort of fit into their ability to, in fact, provide and continue to produce, even in the context of a lot of instability. Likewise, the conversation about rural communities was just so layered and so particular. Maureen mentioned Molly Hemstreet, who spoke so eloquently. She leads the Industrial Commons in Morganton, North Carolina, and spoke just so beautifully about sort of the particularity of her region and the way her network of kind of worker cooperatives in textile, how it's grounded. And she kept using these metaphors related to the textile sort of frame about employee ownership, helping to interweave back the fabric of the community, et cetera. So yes, many different sub themes and sort of layers. And I have to say, having gone to a lot of employee ownership conferences, and they're all wonderful and they all serve a purpose. Some are very scholarly. When we at Rutgers host some of our conferences, they're really designed more for kind of the research community. Others are very kind of company level nuts and bolts, designed to equip, workers and management on the ground within an employee-owned company with the tools to kind of run an employee ownership company better. Others are more focused on political advocacy. I felt like we really hit this other sort of sweet spot that in a way kind of combined all of those things and had just a great deal of kind of intellectual substance and thoughtfulness to the panel. So much so that I heard from so many people there who are deep in the employee ownership community. Some of these people are like world experts on employee ownership, and every last person that I've heard from just said that they took away so much and learned something new. So I think that says a lot.
I think, and it might have been aspirational, but sometimes you also have to get lucky and things just work out. There have been various times where broad themes for employee ownership just tend to emerge. And for example, when I was an ESOP trustee from 2012 to 2019, if you went to the ESOP Association Professional Forum in New Orleans, that's been held in February for many years, you had a sense that the things that the professionals, the practitioners were talking about were going to be the things that we would see in practice and litigation in the next year and a half, et cetera, et cetera. And both last year, your conference, and this year, it seemed to me, first of all, the rural, and not just the rural, but the affected communities were very prevalent. But the theme, and I guess I'm wondering, is it really obvious that I'm stating the obvious, or, was it an accident? But it just seemed that ESOP holding companies, like if I were walking away with any theme whatsoever, it would be there's going to be a lot of attention and change to ESOP holding companies. Was that by design, or did it just happen, or do you think that I just missed it?
Yeah, I guess I would say, I think the ESOP holding companies, I wouldn't say that was necessarily by design. I do think we wanted to think about what are pathways for growth. And I think ESOP holding companies is one thing people were thinking of as pathways for growth, and how we think about growth. Like, should we think about growth as just, more companies that have an ESOP, or should we think about growth as more ESOP plan participants, right? And I thought that was a really interesting conversation. I also thought that, there was a lot of, we did have, for example, Rick Plimpton, who has an employee ownership trust, right? So I think we had Molly Hemstreet, some of their businesses work more like a cooperative, right? So we had different models, and we were very intentional about trying to be very broad in terms of the forms. The panel that Adria was talking about earlier in terms of just equity compensation, right? And sort of thinking about the ways in which broad-based equity compensation can also be employee share ownership, right? So I think we were trying to be very, very broad in terms of the forms and the many forms it can take, and not, and sort of how they fit with different contexts, right? So for some people, an ESOP is absolutely fantastic, right? For some companies, it might be too complicated or too, what have you, right? Like there may be different barriers. It might be too expensive for them to be able to make that transition, right? Maybe that's not the right starting place. So I think we were trying to be very, very, sort of no wrong door, and really think again. So I think we also did really hit, and Adria, I don't know what you think about this, but I think we did really hit a nice combination of sort of like big picture aspirational stories and really practical details of like, how can you do this, right? I mean, I definitely heard people saying, that was really cool what she said about leveraging workforce dollars, and like maybe referencing a particular piece of like some legislation or whatever. And I'm going to see if I can do that over here. And, so I think it was a really nice combination of both of those things where people could really engage and have sort of practical takeaways, but also kind of really inspiring moments to also help you with the heart part of the work.
Adria, I think that, and I say this, I don't know how you would pull it off, but boy, I'd love like the final hour of your conference to be divided among the practitioners and the organizations or whoever with who's going to take the marching orders and who's going to do what. And I'll give you a couple of examples. And Maureen, you had mentioned how, people just heard things. I can give you some that changed my thoughts, but one, for example, the Washington State rep, turning to him again, had mentioned that one of the changes needed in many, many states is adding employees to the rank of minority and women business initiatives. And that held up, have held up ESOPs for so long. And I'm like, wow, that's an aha moment, wide open, easily to, either the state recognizes employee-owned companies or they don't. Whose job is it? Kind of feels like it's Steve Storkins a little bit at EOX, with all the different state centers. But, so wouldn't it be cool to be able to take the plethora of tremendous ideas and then find a way to divvy them up and, here's your marching orders, who's going to do what?
Oh, it would be. A number of ideas surfaced over the course of the ideas forum. And in fact, we did include 2 breakout sessions that really did help people circle around into small groups and kind of dive in more specifically into some kind of like next step type of ideas. And I know we're collecting notes back from at least a number of those small roundtable discussions. But yes, there's much to do, and a lot of different entities are already picking up some of these topics, including the one you just mentioned, Bret. And so it's identifying them, but then also not duplicating efforts, making sure that the community is in dialogue enough that we have a sense for sort of who's in what lane and we can support one another mutually. But yes, certainly. Yeah.
I would really agree with that, because I think the role is more for people who are working on these issues to find each other. And I think people did, right? So I think I would feel a little too command and control to try to like say, okay, here's the game plan at the end of the day. But I definitely, I definitely was seeing people making connections. This issue of procurement and why can't we recognize employee-owned companies, particularly, it's just seems so nonsensical when a company goes employee-owned. Talking with APIS and Heritage about this, right? The whole point is that they are bringing employee ownership to businesses that have employees of color, right? And so that they would lose their minority business designation because of becoming employee ownership just really doesn't make any sense. So how we can sort of try to figure that out. And we've been doing work on this. Others have been doing work on this. Changing procurement systems is actually surprisingly difficult. But I do think it was really helpful for many people who've been like, well, I've been thinking about it over from this perspective, and somebody else saying, well, I've been thinking it over here from the perspective of corporations and how they think about their ESG spend, and somebody else thinking about it from a different lens. So I think that was really valuable for those people to find each other and figure out how they can support each other and support what each other's doing and share notes. So
I agree with Maureen. And circling back, Bret, to what you said just a minute ago about how you went to another conference and you felt like the things the professionals were presenting, were foreshadowing what's to come. Maureen, I don't know what you think, but I do feel like we did kind of lean into the leading edge of some of these questions, and we did surface some information that will sort of shine the light forward, whether that was Lisa Gomez talking about our long-awaited employee ownership initiative housed within the Department of Labor that has kind of gotten its feet underneath it and sort of pointing toward what her upcoming activities will be. Two, as you mentioned, Bret, holding companies, which is really one example, like Maureen said, of creating an organizational infrastructure that allows for scale. And holding companies also can give smaller companies that get sort of absorbed into the larger holding company access to an ESOP or a similar structure if, they may have been too small otherwise. But holding companies are just one example of many different sort of networked and organizational forms that can kind of accomplish that. And I felt like we planted some of those seeds and other topics too. We at the Rutgers Institute, we see broad-based equity compensation as a sort of under-discussed piece of the employee ownership movement. And I know that one piece that we're going to be continuing to lift up is equity compensation, so stock-based compensation, and really examining the disparities in equity ownership and really pushing the conversation around equity compensation in a more inclusive, broad-based direction, because sometimes when people talk about equity compensation, they really think of it as almost executive pay. But in fact, as our panel at the Ideas Forum illustrated, in fact, there's lots of space within this concept for companies to develop quite radically inclusive versions of, stock sharing under the banner of equity comp. So that's another piece that I think will continue to surface over the next year or two.
I'm glad you made that point, because I look at things through certain prisms and, employee ownership, but it's also the broad-based employee ownership. So there are plenty of things going on both at Rutgers and at the Aspen Institute that I absolutely get and appreciate, and it's what both of your organizations do. It's just not what I try to narrow very focusedly, but I do have the bias when I hear equity compensation. My bias says, that's to go to management, which, in a different lifetime I was all about. But now, I'm glad to hear that it's the broad-based thing. One of the other examples, and I'll share it by just way of saying I had a aha moment myself. Another example of something that had trended is 3 or 4 years ago, it seemed that employee ownership trusts had the same kind of buzz, where you would just hear EOTs begin to discuss in the United States. And very candidly, when I first became aware of EOTs, it was as an ESOP trustee, and Chris, Michael, and I got on the phone and we're going to have him come on the podcast. But I was like, as an ESOP trustee, and the trustee firm produced the podcast, so I was doing it as a trustee. Said, got to tell you, I don't like them. I don't care for them. So I'll be very respectful, but I'm going to have to give you pushback because it's not ESOPs. And then I happen to have Graham Nuttall, who you both know from England, who came on, and employee ownership trusts are the way employee ownership is done in England. And suddenly I got it, and I absolutely understood it. And then I heard something, I think it was Rick Plimpton, who you had mentioned, who was speaking, and it just made me go, oh, I get it. And this wouldn't be for every company. But he said they had looked at being an ESOP, but ultimately for his company, it was very important that they never have the ability to be sold, period. And as an ESOP trustee, I freely admitted, boy, if you have a $10 million company and somebody offered $500 million, we're going to recommend you sell. It's just too, lucrative to the employee owners. And he said an employee ownership trust was a way to hardwire the DNA that the company could not be sold or acquired. And I just had that aha moment of, if that's what you want to do, and I wouldn't recommend it in every case, and but if that's what the company wants to do, that's a great reason to have an employee ownership trust, among many others at this point. But that's also what the conference does. It has, not that I had it, but everybody attending will just hear something that will hit. And people have walked away from your conference with either thoughts or practical things to apply in their advocacy or in their business practices.
Yeah. No, I think that's great. And I do think it's about this sort of, purpose, right? Like, I think for Rick, it was really, what is the purpose? What have I seen my company be able to accomplish here in the community where I live and that I care about? And, and I think we heard a lot of business owners thinking in that way in terms of the legacy of their business and what they wanted their business to mean, right? And I thought that was really, that was really inspiring. And there were two things I kind of wanted to comment on a little bit related to the equity, because it made me think about something that I think we talked about fairly explicitly this year, which is the problem of wealth inequality, right? So we talked, I think, very explicitly about the problem of wealth inequality, and that, fundamentally the inequality of ownership in business assets is the principal driver of wealth inequality in the US, right? Because that's where the money is, right? So, and there's different statistics, 80%, 90% of equities are held by the top 10% of, wealthiest households, right? And that there's only maybe 1% in the bottom. And that's pretty much just looking at the stock market, never mind sort of all of the wealth that's in privately held companies, right? So I was really glad. I really appreciated sort of the open conversation about wealth inequality and the ways in which ownership can hopefully even that out. And I think that was part of the spirit of having the shares lab at Rutgers, right? And sort of thinking through this question of, sort of ownership of equities. And I think it is one of these questions that more and more people are starting to realize is sort of fundamental. If we want our democracy to function, it needs to function for everybody. And that means the economy has to function for everybody. And we really have to, sort of look at this imbalance that we have in the society and think about what that means in terms of how people can have stable lives and feel like the way that things are, that they are included in the American dream. Right. So I thought that was really important. I think, last year we did have, and it's something we've done a lot of work on at the Institute, is we also had a conversation on other kind of equity, right, in terms of how employee ownership can advance sort of can address the wealth gap, the racial wealth gap, as well as gender wealth gap. We did a publication on that in partner with Rutgers and Democracy at Work Institute. And I think, so you did ask earlier what we could have done more. I think we could have done more this year to lift that theme up again a little bit more. So that's one thing that I've just been reflecting on, because it is something that in our work we think about a lot, and it's an important discussion, and I know sometimes it's might feel like for some folks it's not necessarily a welcome discussion, but again, it is such an important discussion when we think about the fractures in our society and how people have the different experiences of our economy, to be mindful of that. And so I think that's something that I've just sort of been thinking about. And the other thing I was thinking about, again, last year we did have one worker owner participate, and we didn't have worker owners this year. So I'm thinking next year, let's maybe have a whole panel that's just worker owners instead of management. Let's have the worker owners come talk about their experience. I think that would be really fun. So there's different things I'm thinking about, like, okay, we didn't do that this year, but maybe we'll do that next year. So, or maybe we did it last year and then we decided not to do it again this year, but maybe we should bring it back. I don't know. So these are things I'm thinking about. I don't know, Bret, actually, if you have thoughts about, what we should be doing, and we're looking for other folks' ideas too.
Well, first of all, I wouldn't presume, because the programs will be absolutely wonderful. Two comments did come to mind, and the first I'll get out of the way, and just a wee little bit self-serving perhaps, but when you mentioned about having owners come in or maybe doing a panel, I produce, as you both may know, the Owner to Owner podcast, which my friend Jesse Tyler, who works at Hypertherm, is the host. And the concept of that was really simple. There is one podcast type in employee ownership that I can't do authentically. I can't speak as an employee owner. So I can talk to everybody, but I can't speak as an owner. So a couple of years ago, 3 years ago now, I advertised on LinkedIn and Jesse responded. He's a hands-on employee owner himself. He does all the culture stuff with his colleagues at Hypertherm, but his podcast is 2 or 3 employee owners from companies, and they have conversations that the rest of us aren't having, because they're talking about how they talk about ownership in their life. The conversations we couldn't have, just definitionally. And I think it's really important, and I thought it was important when I was an ESOP trustee, and I feel like I'm going to be a little bit preachy now, but I think it's really important for the practitioners in particular, because the advocates generally do a good job, but the practitioners in particular, to spend time with rank and file members of those that their work affects their lives. And there are too many professionals that don't really see any actual employee owners. So I would welcome, participation or engagement, if not a full panel, at the Employee Ownership Ideas Forum. I think that is incredible. And the other thing, Maureen, and it may be that, as I said, I was in and out and missed the second day afternoon completely. So it might have been the panels that I caught. But it seemed to me, although there may not have been an explicit reference to the racial wage gap or wealth gap, et cetera, that was certainly a part of almost all of the panels that I heard in some component or another. If nothing, if APIS and Heritage's, primary focus is lifting up, the racial wealth gap. So having, the founder there speaking, I think necessarily, elevated that as a topic. And I think your panels did a great job of, maybe they weren't there explicitly saying this is what we're there, but it's what they do. And I think that came through. I think that it was, certainly understood through much of the panels that I sat through. Would you agree?
Oh, wonderful. That's great, Bret. I'm so glad to hear that because it is our hope that comes through. But, I think so. I think I got one comment from somebody, and maybe I shouldn't let one comment color my perception too much, that they thought it didn't come through as much this year. So I'm really glad to hear that came through for you because it's something we care about a lot.
Well, and if you're engaged, I think that you can pick it up. And that's not to say, oh, you don't have to do it. Can it always be, elevated? Yes, it's that important. So there are certain things that, are just understood, particularly in employee ownership, that generally the majority of folks, I think, in good faith are trying to lift everybody up. And, as I've often said in employee ownership, we means we, no exceptions, and that's the disparity. So Adria, perhaps if you could talk about the logistics of it. It was one day at the Capitol and then one day at the Aspen Institute. And how does that get decided? Are you going to keep that format in the future? Just the layout of the conference itself, if you don't mind.
Yes, the day one was in the Capitol Visitors Center. And that makes it convenient for members of Congress to pop in as they will. And day two, we were fortunate to have the absolutely spectacularly beautiful Aspen space, including its rooftop terrace. So thank you to Maureen for that. And we as a group, I think a planning group will circle back and decide about the logistics for next year. So I don't want to presume.
It's too early. We're 48 hours past the end of this one, and I'm like,
yeah. Let's go.
Yeah, and I have to say, Adria and I are not the ones who bear the burden of most of the logistical challenges. So we probably aren't the best people to speak to that. And I do want to, and I should thank, our teams, Matt Helmer, Merritt Steuven, Joy Moore, Bethany Dennis. Oh my God, they all did so much work just managing the logistics and everything else. Jack Moriarty has been key in sort of helping us get a room at the Capitol. And so, so there's a lot of people doing a lot of different pieces of the work here. And yeah, and so I also don't want to say anything about the logistics that they would just be surprised by.
It's like the old company sales executive who makes promises and then the folks in the back have to figure out how to make it happen. One other thing that I'll compliment you on, and then, we'll see if each of you have closing thoughts. But one of the things that was excellent, that I thought was really good, is each of the sessions closed with Q&A. And I thought, as someone who attended virtually, that it was absolutely great that there was at least some of the time was given to those who asked questions. You guys had a really cool app that you could, an app for the phone, full-on website for the computer, but you could interact and that sort of thing. And I thought that was great. But the questions from the audience uniformly just showed a lot of engagement, a lot of thinking. And so the questions were great, but how you handled them and including everybody, I thought was very well done.
Well, thank you. We had a great audience, so we really want to give them a chance to engage. So we're really, and honor them with that. And I think that would be what I would say. I'm glad you found that helpful. And it was actually, I'm glad you said that about the app, because we really do and we did have several online questions as well. And it's really great when we have questions from the virtual audience also and can bring those into the room. So Adria, I don't know if you have any other thoughts about that.
The audience was wonderful. It was absolutely wonderful. One thing that I would hope and dream is that, if it were possible to include even more folks sort of from the outer periphery, or people who are curious about employee ownership, but not quite informed enough. I thought we had an incredible mix of people with some connection to employee ownership in the space, and just, again, daring to dream for the future. Like, how wonderful would it be if we had, some folks who for whom this was really, really new, because it's such a spectacular, informative space, and somebody coming in would just absorb so much.
I think that makes perfect sense. And, it is coming to be understood of what an important program it is. So, Maureen, I'm not sure if you just did it, but are there any closing thoughts as we work towards wrapping up? Any closing reflections you'd like to share?
Yeah, I guess I'll just sort of close kind of where I started. Brett, I think you may remember last time we spoke, I said I think of myself as a kind of a lifelong anti-poverty activist and advocate, and think about sort of in particular people's opportunities at work and how can more people, you know, earn a decent living and lead a dignified life and a life of their own choosing. And I feel like, and I've been doing a lot of stuff on that, and it just has been hard work sometimes because you feel like you're, stuck in the quicksand and really not making a lot of progress. And I tell you, I came home from the Employee Ownership Ideas Forum and I said to my husband, like, these are the days I'm happy and I come home hopeful, right? And I feel so hopeful about the potential of employee ownership to really give so many more people that opportunity to earn a decent living and lead a dignified life. And that's why I'm in this work.
That is very well said. Adria, closing thoughts for us.
Closing thoughts. Well, first, responding to, I really appreciated Maureen raising the point about the racial wealth gap. And as Maureen was just sharing her thoughts, I pulled up our Shares Laboratory report. And Bret, if you'll permit me, I would like to just read out loud one statistic about the racial wealth gap when it comes to equity ownership in the United States, because I do think it's important to be specific and to actually name the numbers. So if what we found, we analyzed the General Social Survey looking at equity ownership, so stock ownership nationwide among a nationally representative sample of American workers. We looked at who owns how much equity, who owns how much stock. And we found that for Black workers, the average dollar value of equity was $4,479. And what we found was that amount is only 2% of the value that white employees held, which was $204,728. Latinx, or the label they use as Hispanic employees, had a little over $55,000, a little bit in between there. But just the numbers are just so stark and and we know that they're the product of a lot of deeper structures and hundreds of years of racial hierarchy and extraction. But it does bear naming out loud just the extent of that inequity, which I think does underpin so much in our society. My other closing thought, sort of building on that, I think has to do with this being an election year. And this, I think, is consistent with what Maureen said, but we have just such a polarized society with so many inequities, so many polarizations. There's the racial wealth gap is sort of paramount in motivating my own work. But the larger political polarization, some of which has to do with kind of the erosion of a sense of economic stability and security for the working class more broadly. And to be in this space where you saw people from all backgrounds, from all political persuasions, kind of consensus around this core idea, which is an idea fundamentally about sharing. It is fundamentally an idea, whatever way you cut it, whether you're the right wing or the left wing or whatever your vantage point. Fundamentally, when you talk about employee ownership, you are talking about more employees, more working people, sharing in the profits, sharing in the wealth, spreading the rewards of our economy much more broadly than it already is. And I think, echoing Maureen, particularly sort of bracing for the upcoming election year, which is going to be terribly polarized, I think there was something important about the space that we built and the way that this topic can pull people together in that way.
I think that is beautiful. And your point is well taken. And the, topics of just racial wealth gap alone merits an EO Ideas Forum type, emphasis for several days on its own. There is certainly a bit of, so many different issues to address, so my thought that it was represented, even though not highlighted perhaps, was not to minimize the worthiness of the conversation. And it kind of ties in with both of what you said, and it builds upon where I am. And I could easily get emotional as I say this because I'm very sincere about it. All of us in our different ways are doing really important work. And I'll tie into what I said, where sometimes the practitioners need to see the rank and file employee owners. The work that's being done in employee ownership changes lives. It improves communities. It makes a difference. And we're always going to find, as is true with life, that there's always more that can be done. And when you start to make progress with some disenfranchised or disadvantaged people, you realize how many more need the attention. But it doesn't take away from the fact that all of us can feel very good about the field that we're in, because nobody can talk about employee-owned companies hurting their communities or causing economic, damage. It's all very, very positive stuff. But in the space, and I used to be a very political person. I volunteered for political campaigns in junior high and senior high, and I can't have conversations with anybody about politics these days. I shouldn't say anybody, but just about, and I don't care to, because I've never had a sense that in recent years that people really want to listen or try to understand. And to be in an environment and employee ownership, and by the way, I don't talk politics on the podcast, but as I often joke, when you say things like "we" means we, you're getting a vibe of, it's we're all in this together. I don't think you have to go deep down to figure out where my head's at, but to be in an area that in its own weird way is kind of a mini safe space of politics. And I'm not trying to misuse that term, but where we can come in and we can all say, look, if you're on the corporate side and you love the ESOPs versus the socialist side, that might be a little bit of a worker co-op vibe. And then there's the broad area in the middle where we can come together and we don't have to get into the ugliness that's really dividing the country. And I don't know if it's good to not be engaged in it. I just don't want to spend much of my time just arguing with people for the sake of arguing. But the spaces that both of your organizations regularly provide and the work at Moving Employee Ownership is just so important and just so appreciated.
Yeah, I just want to say, I think that, on that point, and I had mentioned this a little bit before, but I think, thinking about how does this work within the workplace and bring people together who, might have been the people that they don't want to talk to each other about politics because they have these preconceptions, right? And they can have that experience of not agreeing with each other but still being good coworkers and colleagues and maybe even liking each other, right? And I think that, that when workplaces can be built so that that is possible, that's the kind of healing that we need. And so I think that there are ways that some of the workplaces that are very intentional about how they build an ownership culture and about how they include everybody. And I think they do contribute to that kind of healing in their communities. I think we heard some of our panelists talk about that, because they can support each other as human beings and, get beyond sort of what we're told we should think about one side or the other. So I think that that's been, maybe that's undervalued and maybe that's a bit Pollyannish. And of course, it doesn't work like that everywhere. But I don't know. I'm always a little nervous about how much we accept polarization, and I feel like we can get beyond it. We can if we start believing we can.
That is an excellent point. I will tell you that I'd like to think that I am really good at nuance in a time when nuance is not necessarily valued, or coming through the details. Hey, I understand that the conference was going to be put online and available for viewing. Is it already?
So it is not yet. Sometime next week, we should have the links and everything up. There's a little bit of, particularly, you may have noticed a few technical glitches this year. So there's a little bit of smoothing and editing to try to get things in order.
And the technical glitches are part of the game. And to be very specific, the Capitol was not built way back when with, great Wi-Fi in mind. So it was absolutely wonderful. And we on the podcast certainly understand there are occasionally things that make things a little bit tough to get online when we would like. What I will tell our listeners is that when the link is available, we will include it in the show notes as we're dropping this episode late Tuesday. I'm not sure we'll have the link in the show notes there, but whenever you make it available, we will include it. Maureen, thank you so much for everything that you've done, and thank you for spending the time with us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having us, Bret.
Look forward to having you back. And Adria, thank you, for coming back again. I appreciate it. I always love talking to you and seeing what you're doing. And if there are some of the issues that you think merit conversation, I know Rutgers, and this is worth a whole podcast, has all of these great fellows that are involved beside your people. I would love to put together panels for the podcast on any topic that you think would be important. So if you reach out and say, hey, Bret, talk to these guys, these men or women, I'd be absolutely thrilled to help move the conversation forward that way in any way that I could. Heck, I'd take the week off and let you host the podcast, if you prefer. But Adria, thank you so much for joining us.
Bret, can I say one more? I just want to say I'm very sad that Joseph Blasi could not be at the forum. I want to say how much work he did in building this, how much work he did in building that community of scholars. That was an amazing contributor to this forum. Joseph was with us in spirit every step of the way. He was with us working on it and all the preparation. So just want to sort of thank him and honor all the work that he did for the forum and all the work that he has done over his career for the field of employee ownership.
Thank you, Maureen.
Maureen, thank you for sharing that. Joseph Blasi is just one of these folks that if we ever get around to instituting an Employee Ownership Hall of Fame, he would be a first ballot entry for all of the work that he's doing. And Adria, it's cool that your colleagues are continuing on that tradition. So thank you for recognizing the work that he did in this conference and the previous ones as well. With that, with extreme gratitude to Maureen Conway and Adria Scharf, I am so grateful to them for coming on and doing the highlight. Make sure you check it out online when the links become available. It is, as I've said a number of times, just such an important program. You will get something out of it. So check out all the sessions at your leisure when it's online. And thank you very much for listening. This is Bret Keisling. Be well.
We'd love to hear from you. You can find us on Facebook at EO Podcast Network and on Twitter at ESOP Podcast. This podcast has been produced by Bret Keisling for the EO Podcast Network. Original music composed by Max Keisling. Branding and marketing by Bitsy Plus Design. And I'm Bitsy McCann.